The morning Birdie Shepard walked into the dusty little town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878. She was carrying nothing but a worn carpetbag, a broken heart she hadn't yet named, and the fierce, unshakable conviction that the life behind her was no longer worth returning to. The stage depot sat at the far end of the main street, wedged between a saloon that smelled of sawdust and whiskey and a dry goods store with sun-bleached bolts of calico hanging in the window. Birdie had been walking since before dawn, following the rutted wagon road south from the farmstead, where she had spent the last 2 years of her 24 years of life working as a hired hand for a family that had never once used her first name. She was not a sentimental woman by nature, but she was an honest one, and she was honest enough with herself to know that the moment she had set down her mending basket and walked out of the Hendersons' front door without looking back, she had stepped off the edge of something familiar and into something entirely unknown. She didn't mind. Unknown, she had decided somewhere around mile 3 of that long walk, was better than certain misery. The depot was a small, squat building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Caldwell Stage and Freight, and beneath it, in smaller letters that had mostly been blistered off by the sun, something about scheduled departures. A man sat on a bench outside, and Birdie almost didn't notice him at first because he looked so thoroughly like a piece of the landscape, like something the wind had deposited there and forgotten about. He was lean in the way a man gets when he hasn't eaten properly in some time, his long legs stretched out in front of him, and his boots crossed at the ankle. His hat was pulled low against the morning glare, a beat-up brown thing with a crease in the brim that suggested it had been sat on more than once. His shirt had been dark blue once, maybe, but the sun had turned it the color of a winter sky over flat prairie. He had his hands resting loosely on his knees and his eyes were closed, and for a moment Birdie thought he might be sleeping. She stepped around him to get to the depot door, and he opened his eyes. They were a striking shade of gray-green, those eyes, the color of sage after rain, and they settled on her with a calm, unhurried attention that she found, for reasons she couldn't have immediately explained, both unsettling and entirely honest. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who chose his words carefully, not because he was slow but because he understood their weight. "Morning," Birdie said and pulled open the door. The man behind the counter inside the depot was broad-shouldered and entirely bald, with a magnificent mustache that seemed to be compensating for the absence of hair elsewhere on his head. He looked up from a ledger with the expression of a man who had seen too many people come through that door with problems he couldn't solve. "Help you?" he said. "I need a ticket," Birdie said. "Wherever the next stage is going." The man behind the counter looked at her with the particular weariness of someone who had been asked variations of this question many times and had learned that no good ever came of it. "Next stage is the Wichita run. Leaves tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock sharp." "How much?" $1.50. Birdie opened her carpetbag and counted what she had. $1.30, 3 hairpins, a small tin of peppermint she had been saving, and the pressed wildflower her mother had given her the last time she had seen her mother alive, which had been 7 years ago. She closed the bag. "I'll have the $1.50 by tomorrow morning," she said, with a confidence she did not entirely feel. The man behind the counter looked at her with the same weary expression. "Office opens at 5:30, he said. "Ticket price don't change." Birdie walked back out into the morning heat and stood on the porch of the stage depot, and she was doing the arithmetic of her situation in her head and finding the numbers unhelpful when the man on the bench said, without opening his eyes, "They gouging you in there." "Ticket's $1.50, Birdie said. "I have $1.30. 20 cents short," he said, still not opening his eyes. "I'm aware of my own arithmetic, thank you." He opened his eyes then, and looked at her again with that calm, sea-colored gaze. He straightened up slowly on the bench and pushed his hat back from his forehead, and she could see that he was perhaps a year or two older than she was, maybe 25 or 26, with a jaw shadowed by several days of not shaving, and a face that was browned by the sun in the particular way of men who spent most of their time outdoors. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, fine and silver, and it gave his face a kind of asymmetry that she found, despite herself, interesting. "Joseph Shelby," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then shook it. "Birdie Shepard. Where are you headed, Miss Shepard?" "Wichita, and then farther south after that, probably." "I have a cousin in Texas." He nodded. His hand had dropped back to his knee. "Long way." "Far enough," she said, which wasn't quite an answer but felt like one. She sat down on the far end of the bench because her feet hurt from the walk and there was nowhere else particularly obvious to sit, and she set her carpetbag between her feet and looked at the street. Caldwell in the summer of 1878 was a place in the middle of becoming something. The cattle trade had pushed its way up through Kansas during the previous years, and towns like this one had sprung up along the cattle trails, the way wildflowers spring up after rain, fast and bright and sometimes fragile. The street was wide enough for two wagons to pass each other with room to spare, and this morning it held a freight wagon, a pair of horses hitched outside the saloon, and a dog sleeping in the middle of the road with the contentment of an animal that had made its peace with everything. "You been in Caldwell long?" Birdie asked, not because she was particularly curious, but because the silence, while not unpleasant, seemed like it needed something in it. "About a week," Joseph Shelby said. "Working." There was a small pause that told her the answer before he gave it. "Looking," he said. She understood that. Looking was the polite word for the particular state of a person between one thing and the next, when the one thing had ended and the next hadn't yet begun. She had been in that state herself for the past several days. "What do you do?" she asked. "Ranch work mostly. Some blacksmithing when ranching slow." He turned his hat in his hands. "I had a position up in Dodge City until about 3 weeks ago. Foreman decided he didn't need as many hands going into fall." "I'm sorry," she said. He shrugged, and it was a genuine shrug, not a performance of indifference. "It happens. What about you?" "Domestic work, cooking, cleaning, sewing. I was with a family south of here for 2 years. She paused. "I left." He didn't ask why, which she appreciated. People who asked why were usually people who wanted the pleasure of your answer more than they wanted anything good for you. They sat for a while in the increasing warmth of the morning, and Birdie watched the town wake up around them. The general store opened its shutters. A woman came out of a house 2 doors down and swept her porch with the focused energy of someone who had strong opinions about dust. 2 cowboys riding in from the north pulled up at the saloon, which seemed to Birdie an optimistic choice for that hour of the morning, but was none of her concern. After a time, Joseph Shelby stood up and said, in the same unhurried way he said everything, "I'm going to get something to eat. There's a place down the street that does a reasonable breakfast. You're welcome to come." Birdie looked up at him. He was tall standing up, taller than she had registered when he was sitting, and he held himself with the quiet, practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to physical work. There was nothing presumptuous about his invitation, nothing that suggested he expected anything from her in return for it. It was simply offered, the way a person in reasonable circumstances offers something to a person in less reasonable ones. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I need to keep my money." "I didn't say you were paying," he said. She looked at him for a moment, assessing. There was a particular kind of man who offered a woman a meal as a down payment on something she hadn't agreed to, and she had spent enough of her life navigating that kind of man to know the signs. But Joseph Shelby didn't look like that man. He looked like a man who had eaten his last meal some time ago and had decided that if he was going to eat, he preferred company to doing it alone. "All right," she said, and picked up her carpetbag. The place down the street was called Mabel's, though whether Mabel was a person who still existed or simply a name that had stayed on the sign after its owner had gone was unclear. The inside was a single room with 6 tables and a counter, and it smelled wonderfully of coffee and salt pork and something sweet that turned out to be a pan of cornbread someone had just pulled from the oven. They took a table by the window, and a woman who was either Mabel herself or had inherited her responsibilities brought them 2 cups of coffee without being asked, which Birdie thought was an admirable way to run a business. Joseph ordered eggs and bacon and cornbread. Birdie ordered coffee and cornbread only, because 20 cents was 20 cents and she needed it. He didn't say anything about her order. She noticed that he didn't say anything about it and noticed her own noticing, which she found mildly interesting. The coffee was good and the cornbread was better, and for a little while they talked in the careful, exploratory way of two people who are strangers deciding how much to trust each other. He was from Missouri originally, he told her, a town called Independence, and he had come west 4 years ago after the farm his family had worked had been sold to pay debts that weren't entirely his father's fault, but had fallen on the family anyway. He spoke about this without bitterness, which she found remarkable, because she had known people to carry far lighter losses with far heavier hearts. She told him she was from Illinois, from a small town near Galesburg, and that her mother had died when she was 17 and her father had remarried within the year, which was his right, and that she had found herself in the particular position of being a daughter who was still present but no longer quite necessary in a household that had reorganized itself around a new center. She had gone looking for work at 18 and had been going ever since. 6 years, he said, when she had finished. 6 years, she agreed. You ever get tired of going? She thought about that honestly. Sometimes, she said. Mostly I get tired of the places I end up. The going itself I don't mind so much. He nodded as if this made perfect sense to him, and she had the odd sensation that it did. After breakfast, which he paid for without making a ceremony of it, they walked back to the stage depot and then, because there was not much else to do and neither of them had anywhere pressing to be before tomorrow morning, they kept walking, down to the end of the main street and back, and then a second time, talking as they went. She learned that he had a brother back in Missouri named Thomas who had married a schoolteacher and was doing well enough, and that he wrote to his brother twice a year because writing more often than that felt like admitting he had more time on his hands than was dignified. He learned that she had taught herself to read by the time she was 5 by memorizing the labels on the jars in her mother's pantry, and that she still sometimes thought of the world in those terms, categories and contents, things that could be preserved and things that couldn't. She also learned by mid-morning that he was flat broke. He mentioned it without particular drama, the way you mention a fact that is unpleasant but not catastrophic, like rain forecast for a day you had hoped to work outside. I have enough for maybe one more meal, he said, as they stood outside the general store looking at the posted prices of things neither of them was going to buy. And then after that I suppose I'll see. Birdie looked at him. He was looking at the posted prices with a thoughtful expression, as if he were doing arithmetic of his own. Are you waiting for something? She asked. In Caldwell. I heard there might be work at one of the ranches east of here. Fellow in the saloon last night said the Delaney outfit was looking for a couple of extra hands to bring in the last of their summer cattle. He paused. I was going to ride out and ask, but I sold my horse 2 weeks ago. You sold your horse? Man offered me a fair price, and I needed the money more than I needed the horse. He said this without embarrassment, and she appreciated that too. A man who could sell his horse without his pride dissolving in the process was a man who had a reasonable relationship with reality. How far east is the Delaney ranch? 8, 9 miles, maybe. She looked at the sky, then at his boots, which were worn but intact, and then at him. You could walk that. I could, he agreed. I was planning to tomorrow, he stopped. After you what? He seemed for a moment to consider whether to say the next thing, and then to decide that he had already said this much and there was no particular reason to stop now. I was thinking I'd see if I could find some work here today first. Day labor, hauling or something. Earn enough to— He stopped again. She waited. I wanted to make sure you had enough for your ticket before I worried about myself, he said. The sentence landed between them like something dropped from a height. Birdie looked at him and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. We have been acquainted for approximately 3 hours, she said finally. About that, he agreed. "You don't know anything about me. I know you walked a long way this morning," he said, "and you're trying to get to Texas and you're 20 cents short and you didn't tell me that to ask for anything, you just said it like a fact." She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I'm not trying to presume anything," he said with perfect seriousness. "I just thought it seemed like a practical matter. You need 20 cents. I might be able to earn 20 cents by end of day." It seemed simple. "It is not simple," she said. "Why not?" She searched for the answer and found, to her irritation, that she didn't have a good one. It wasn't simple because accepting money from a stranger felt like owing something she hadn't agreed to owe, but he had already made it fairly clear, in the 3 hours she had known him, that he didn't seem to operate on that kind of ledger. It wasn't simple because she had been self-sufficient for 6 years, and the idea of being 20 cents dependent on someone she had just met felt like a kind of defeat. But when she examined that feeling honestly, she recognized it as pride of the kind that didn't actually serve her, the kind that would rather choose difficulty than accept a small kindness. "Thank you," she said. "That's a kind thing." "It's a practical thing," he said, but there was a warmth in his voice that she was beginning to recognize as his version of something more expressive. He spent the morning doing exactly what he had said he would do. He walked into the freight yard at the north end of town and offered his labor to the yard boss, and by noon he was carrying crates of goods from the receiving area to the storage shed in a systematic and unhurried way that suggested he was accustomed to hard work and not inclined to make a spectacle of it. Birdie, for her part, went to the general store and offered her services to the woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Delacroix, who turned out to be considerably more interesting than her husband, the nominal proprietor, who appeared to be largely decorative. Mrs. Delacroix was a compact, energetic woman in her 40s with strong opinions about the organization of her inventory, and a backroom that had been in a state of chaos since April, when a large freight delivery had arrived and been deposited without ceremony. She offered Birdie $1.20 for a full day's work organizing the backroom and mending 3 shirts that belonged to Mr. Delacroix and that he needed before Sunday. Birdie did the arithmetic with great satisfaction. $1.20 from Mrs. Delacroix, plus the $1.30 she already had, minus the $1.50 for the stage ticket, left $1 even, which meant she would have $1 left over after buying her ticket, which was not precisely wealth but was considerably better than what she had started the day with. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, sorting and shelving goods in the Delacroix backroom with a methodical energy that Mrs. Delacroix observed with approval, and the occasional interjection of information about where things had come from and why they were in the wrong place, and who was responsible for the general state of affairs, which was, it emerged, largely a man named Bill Cutter who drove the supply wagon and who had, according to Mrs. Delacroix, the organizational instincts of a badger. At midday, Birdie took a short break and walked back down the street toward the freight yard, because she had been thinking, ever since the morning conversation, about Joseph Shelby and the 8 or 9 miles to the Delaney Ranch, and the fact that he was going to walk it tomorrow on whatever was left in him after a day of loading crates. She found him at the water trough at the edge of the freight yard, washing the sweat from his face and neck with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had learned to take care of himself in whatever circumstances he found himself in. "How's it going?" she asked. He looked up. There was something in the way his expression shifted when he saw her, a small, involuntary brightening that she noticed and filed away. "Good," he said. "Yard boss is a fair man. He'll square up with me at end of day." "How much?" "Should be about 60 cents. 60 cents was more than 20. She looked at him. "You don't have to give me the 20 cents, she said. "I sorted things out with Mrs. Delacroix at the general store. I'll have enough for my ticket and then some." He looked at her with that calm, steady gaze. "That's good," he said, and she could hear that he meant it entirely, that there was no disappointment in it, only genuine gladness. It told her something about him that she thought was worth knowing. She went back to the general store and finished the backroom and mended the 3 shirts, which took longer than the backroom, because one of them had a tear in the collar that required more care than it might have if Mr. Delacroix had possessed better luck with collars. By the time the sun was getting low and golden over the flat Kansas plain, the shirts were done, and the backroom was organized according to a system that Birdie had devised and explained to Mrs. Delacroix, who listened to the explanation with the focused attention of a woman who intended to maintain standards. Mrs. Delacroix paid her the $1.20 in coin and also gave her 2 pieces of wrapped hard candy, which Birdie tucked into her carpetbag next to the peppermints. She was coming out of the store when she saw Joseph Shelby coming down the street from the direction of the freight yard, moving with the particular gait of a man who is tired but not defeated, and carrying something wrapped in paper that turned out, when he stopped in front of her, to be a small parcel of food from Mabel's. "End of day," he said. "Yard boss paid up. I got us something to eat." She looked at the parcel and then at him. "You spent your wages on food." "Most of it," he said. "I've got about 30 cents left." "Joseph." She stopped herself because she had been about to say something about the wisdom of this and had realized mid-sentence that she was not his keeper, and he was not a child, and he had made a choice that was generous and not foolish. "I'll be all right," he said. "I've been all right on less." They sat on the bench in front of the stage depot again, in the long golden light of the Kansas evening, and ate what he had brought, which was cold roasted chicken and bread and 2 pieces of apple pie, and Birdie thought she had eaten less pleasant meals at considerably more expensive tables. Around them, the town was settling into its evening rhythms. The saloon was louder now, its light spilling yellow out onto the street. A family with 3 children walked past toward the small church at the end of the road. 2 men in trail-dusty clothes stood outside the barber shop having a conversation that involved a lot of gesturing south. "What will you do?" she asked. "If the Delaney place doesn't need you?" "Find something else," he said, without particular alarm. He was looking at the sky, which was doing impressive things in shades of orange and deep rose over the edge of the plain. There's always something, if you're willing to do it. And what kind of something are you willing to do? He considered this with the seriousness he gave to most things. "Honest work," he said. "I don't need it to be pretty, I need it to be straight." She looked at his profile in the evening light. The scar on his cheekbone caught the gold of the sunset. "How did you get that?" she asked before she had entirely decided to ask it. He touched his face briefly, the unconscious gesture of a man who had been asked this question before. "Got too close to a fight that wasn't mine," he said. "About 4 years ago, in Dodge City, a man was beating on someone who couldn't defend themselves, and I got involved, and the man's friend expressed his disagreement with my involvement." Looked at him for a long moment. "Were you all right? Better than the man who was being beaten," he said simply. "Which was the point?" The sky finished its display and settled into deep purple and then dark, and the first stars appeared over the Kansas plain with the crisp, brilliant clarity that was particular to that flat landscape, where there was nothing between you and the sky to soften or obscure it. "You should get some sleep," he said, when the street had gone mostly quiet. "Stage leaves early." "I know," she said. She looked at her carpetbag and then at him. "Where are you sleeping tonight?" He gestured vaguely toward the edge of the freight yard. "There's a place out back where they let me lay my bedroll. It's comfortable enough." She wanted to say something more and couldn't find the right shape for it. What she felt was something like reluctance, which surprised her, because she had been certain that morning, as she had walked the road into Caldwell, that what she wanted was to leave, to keep moving, to find her cousin in Texas and begin the next version of her life. But sitting here in the dark with this man who said what he meant and did what he said, she found the certainty of morning had become something softer and more complicated. "I'll see you in the morning," she said finally. "I'll walk you to the depot," he said. 6 o'clock. She found a room at the boarding house 2 streets back, run by a Mrs. Pruitt, who charged 35 cents for a bed and the use of the washing basin, and asked no questions beyond the necessary ones. The bed was narrow, and the room was warm, and Birdie lay on top of the quilt and stared at the ceiling and thought about Joseph Shelby's gray-green eyes and the way he had said he wanted to make sure she had enough for her ticket before he worried about himself, and about the way he had bought dinner with his day wages without making a performance of it. She thought about 30 cents and 8 miles and a man walking in the heat to ask for work he might not get. She slept eventually, but not easily. Morning came with the particular sharp clarity of a Great Plains dawn, the sky going from black to deep indigo to a pale, luminous gray in the span of what seemed like minutes, and Birdie was up and dressed and at the stage depot by 5:45. He was already there. Of course he was already there. He was sitting on the bench in exactly the same posture as the morning before, and she thought, looking at him in the early light, that he was one of the most consistent people she had ever met, which was something she had not previously thought to want in a person but found, suddenly and clearly, that she did. The depot opened at 5:30 and Birdie had her $1.50 ready and exact. The bald man with the magnificent mustache took it without ceremony and gave her a ticket, and she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her carpetbag, next to her mother's pressed wildflower. She came back out to the porch, and Joseph Shelby was standing now, his hat in his hands, and he looked at her in the morning light with an expression that was doing its best to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. "You're all set," he said. "I am," she said. "Good." He turned his hat slowly in his hands. "I hope Texas is everything you're looking for." She looked at him. His shirt was clean, or at least cleaner, and she could see that he had taken some care with himself this morning that he hadn't bothered with the previous one, and she understood that this small evidence of effort meant something. Down the street, she could see the stage being brought around. 2 horses, a driver climbing up to the box, another man loading baggage into the boot at the back. She thought about her cousin in Texas, a woman named Eliza who had written her twice in the last year, cheerful letters full of dust and children, and the particular enthusiasms of a woman who had built a life from unlikely materials and was proud of it. Texas was real and specific and waiting for her. She thought about 30 cents and 8 miles. "Wait here," she said. She walked quickly and with the purposeful stride of someone who has made a decision and is not going to allow herself time to unmake it, to the restaurant called Mabel's. The woman behind the counter looked up from wiping tables. "Can I get something to take away?" Birdie said. "Bread and bacon and whatever else you have that'll keep." The woman behind the counter looked at her with the mild curiosity of someone who was not paid to ask questions. "Cornbread and salt pork. Got biscuits too." "All of it," Birdie said, "and whatever comes to the most I can buy with this." She opened her hand. In her palm was the $1 she had kept from the previous evening's wages, the one beyond the ticket price. She spent 80 cents. The woman behind the counter wrapped everything up in a cloth and handed it to her, and Birdie walked back down the street to the stage depot and found Joseph Shelby exactly where she had left him, now watching the stage horses with the attentive eye of a man who knew horses and was assessing these particular ones automatically. She handed him the bundle. He looked at it, then at her, then at it again. "What's this?" "Food," she said, "for the walk to the Delaney Ranch, and for whatever comes after if the walk doesn't turn into work." He held the bundle as if it had surprised him, which it had. "Birdie, you spent your wages on dinner last night," she said, before he could say something about not being able to accept it. "This is 20 cents worth of fairness and 60 cents worth of practicality. Take it." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that she hadn't heard before, something that was rough and careful at once, the voice of a man handling something he was afraid to break. "You need that for Texas." "I have 20 cents left," she said. "That's plenty to get me to Wichita, and from Wichita I'll find something." He looked at her steadily, and she looked back at him with the honest, undefended gaze that was her nature, and somewhere down the street the stage driver hollered that they were loading up in 5 minutes. "You should go," Joseph said. His jaw was set in a way that told her he was working to keep his face composed. She looked at the stage. She looked at him. And something happened in the space between those two looks that was not small and was not simple, something that had been building since the previous morning on the road into Caldwell, and had been growing in the particular, unhurried way of things that are real. "I don't think I'm going," she said. The words came out with perfect clarity, and she felt, the moment she said them, the way you feel when you have been uncertain about something for a long time and then are suddenly, completely certain. Not the absence of fear, just the absolute presence of the right thing. Joseph Shelby stared at her. "What? I spent your dollar on food," she said. "You offered it to me and I spent it on food for you instead, and I'm not getting on that stage." "Birdie." He said her name with such a combination of disbelief and intensity that she felt it all the way through. "You had a plan, Texas, your cousin." "My cousin will still be there," she said. "Texas isn't going anywhere." "But you," he stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her with those gray-green eyes that missed nothing. Why? She considered how honest to be and decided that complete honesty was the only kind worth giving. "Because you are the first person in a very long time," she said, "who did something kind for me without wanting anything back from it, and I would like to know more about a person like that." He was still holding the bundle of food. His hands had gone very still. "Birdie, I'm broke. I sold my horse, I don't have a position." "I know all of that," she said. "I was there for both conversations." "I can't," he stopped again. "I'm not asking you to take care of me," she said clearly. "I took care of myself for 6 years and I'm very good at it. I'm asking if I can walk 8 miles to the Delaney Ranch with you, because Mrs. Delacroix said yesterday that she'd be happy to have me for at least another few days, and $1.20 a day is enough to keep me comfortable while I decide what comes next." Down the street, the driver hollered again. "Last call." Joseph Shelby looked at the stage, looked at Birdie. His throat worked. Something was happening behind those eyes that she thought she understood, because it was happening in her too. That particular recognition that comes when something you hadn't known you were looking for walks up and introduces itself. "You really aren't getting on that stage," he said, as if he were testing the reality of it. "I spent the ticket money on cornbread and salt pork," she said. "It seems unlikely." The faintest curve of something appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, not yet, but it was the beginning of one. "Then I suppose," he said, very carefully, as if he were setting something fragile down on a steady surface, "that we'd better figure out what comes next." Down the street, the stage rolled out with a clatter of wheels and a cloud of dust, and Birdie Shepard watched it go and felt nothing but a clean, sure lightness. They walked to the Delaney Ranch that same morning. 8.5 miles east of Caldwell, in the particular warm stillness of a Kansas summer morning, with the bundle of food between them and the conversation that had been building for 2 days finding, finally, the room it needed to expand into. She learned things about him on that walk that she had not yet learned, that he had a habit of noticing small things in a landscape and knowing their names, that he could identify 6 species of hawk by flight pattern alone, that he had once spent a winter in Colorado working for a mining operation, and had found the mountains beautiful and the work brutal, and had not been sorry when spring came and he could move again. He laughed twice on that walk, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and she decided that it was one of the better sounds she had heard in recent memory. He learned things about her, that she could cook well enough to make a respectable meal out of materials that most people would have given up on, that she had strong opinions about the rights of working people, that she had once, at the age of 22, written a letter to a newspaper in Chicago about the treatment of women in domestic service, and had been astonished when they had printed it under her initials. He was quiet for a moment after she told him that. "What did you say in the letter?" he asked. "That we do the same work as wives and receive neither the security of marriage nor the recognition of skilled labor," she said, "and that this is a problem worth discussing." He was quiet again, but it was the quiet of someone thinking, not the quiet of someone disapproving. "You're right," he said. "It is." The Delaney Ranch was a proper operation, larger than it had looked on the rough mental map the saloon man had drawn for Joseph, with a main house and a bunkhouse and a series of corrals and a barn that had clearly been built by someone with both ambition and carpentry skills. A man named Harlan Delaney came out to meet them, a weathered, direct man of 50 or so with a pragmatic manner and a foreman's eye for sizing up a potential hand in under 30 seconds. He looked at Joseph. He looked at Birdie. He looked at Joseph again. "Both of you looking for work," he said. "I am," Joseph said. "Ranch work. I've got 4 years of experience with cattle and horses, some blacksmithing. I'm reliable and I know what I'm doing." Delaney looked at Birdie. "I'm not looking for ranch work," she said. "But if your cook is short-handed or your household needs an extra pair of hands, I'm experienced and thorough." As it turned out, Harlan Delaney's cook, a man of spectacular grumpiness named Pete, had been trying to manage the kitchen and the household needs of a 12-man operation by himself since his assistant had left in July. And the state of affairs in the Delaney Ranch house, according to Delaney's wife Martha, who appeared from the house during this conversation with the energy of a woman who had been waiting for this exact moment, was no longer acceptable. Martha Delaney was a practical woman who formed strong opinions quickly and acted on them without delay. Within 10 minutes of meeting Birdie, she had hired her at $1 a day, offered her a room in the ranch house, and pressed a cup of coffee into her hand as if she had always been there. Joseph got hired too, 40 cents a day and bunk room and meals for the fall cattle work. Delaney shook his hand and told him to talk to his foreman, a man named Rodriguez, about what was needed. That evening, after the day's work was done and the supper dishes cleared, Birdie sat on the porch of the ranch house with Martha Delaney and a cup of coffee and watched the sunset paint the Kansas sky in colors that seemed, at this distance from town, even more extravagant than they had the night before. "How long have you and the young man been traveling together?" Martha asked, with the pleasant directness of a woman who asks what she wants to know. "We're not traveling together," Birdie said. "We met yesterday morning." Martha Delaney looked at her with an expression that managed to be simultaneously polite and comprehensively skeptical. "You walked 9 miles in the same direction on the same morning," she said. "Close enough." Birdie looked at the sunset and did not argue this point, because it seemed to her that Martha Delaney might not be wrong. The weeks that followed were full of work, and the particular satisfaction of work done well in a place that needed it. Birdie reorganized the ranch house kitchen with Mrs. Delacroix-level thoroughness, which Pete the cook greeted with a combination of offense at the implication that his previous organization had been lacking and relief that someone else was taking responsibility for it. She mended clothes, kept records, helped Martha Delaney with the considerable administrative load of running a 12-person operation, and discovered, to her pleased surprise, that Martha kept a small shelf of books in the front room and was happy to share them. Joseph worked cattle and horses with the steady, capable competence that had made Harlan Delaney hire him in the first place. Rodriguez, the foreman, was a man of few words but fair judgment, and within the first week he had assessed Joseph Shelby's abilities and deployed them accordingly, which meant that Joseph spent most of his days doing the things he was best at, and the result was that Harlan Delaney was satisfied and Rodriguez was satisfied, and the cattle were as satisfied as cattle get, which is to say they were adequately managed. In the evenings, after supper, Birdie and Joseph found their way to the same spaces. The porch mostly, in the long summer evenings when the air was warm and the sky was spectacular. The barn occasionally, when one of them had a reason to be there and the other happened to be passing. Once, the flat rock by the creek 1/4 mile from the house, where they went separately for water and found each other there, and sat for 2 hours talking about things they had never talked to anyone else about. He told her about his father, who had been a good man and a poor businessman, the combination that ruins more men than either quality alone. He told her about the farm in Missouri, the particular smell of it in the morning, the way the corn came up in early summer, and about the day his father had signed the last papers and sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, and how Joseph had been 16 and had not known what to say and had sat across from him in silence until his mother had come in and done what women who are strong do, which is take hold of whatever is broken and begin. Birdie told him about her mother, who had been small and bright, and had taught her the names of all the plants that grew around their house in Illinois, the useful ones and the beautiful ones, and had believed that knowing the name of a thing was the first step toward not being afraid of it. She told him about the first time she had cooked a proper meal alone, at 17, after her mother was gone, how she had stood in the kitchen with her mother's recipe written out in pencil on a folded piece of paper, and followed it word by word like a map. There were things happening between them in those conversations that neither of them named directly, because naming something too early is a way of spooking it, the way you can spook a horse by approaching too fast. But they both knew. The knowledge sat between them in the evening air, warm and patient, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a Thursday evening in late August, 3 weeks after they had arrived at the Delaney Ranch, when a storm blew in from the northwest with the sudden, dramatic efficiency of Kansas weather, which gives no warning and takes no prisoners. The sky went from clear to catastrophically purple in the space of 20 minutes, and by the time the thunder started, everyone on the ranch was moving with the purposeful urgency of people who had seen this kind of weather before. The cattle were already in the lower pasture and Rodriguez, and 3 of the hands were riding to move them away from the creek, which could flood. Birdie was helping Martha Delaney secure the shutters on the ranch house windows, which involved a ladder and a certain amount of determined effort against a wind that was picking up fast. Joseph appeared at the base of the ladder just as Birdie was reaching for the second shutter, and he steadied the ladder with both hands and said, over the wind, "I've got it." "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine," he said. "I'm steadying the ladder." She secured the shutter and came down, and he was right there at the bottom of the ladder. And when she stepped off the last rung, she was very close to him, close enough to see the rain coming in his eyes a second before it came in everything else. A sudden heavy wall of it that arrived with a crack of thunder and turned the world into sound and silver. They ran for the porch, arriving at it already soaked, and stood under the roof and watched the storm come down with the extravagant totality that good summer storms have on the plains, rain coming sideways, lightning splitting the sky over the flat horizon, thunder rolling on and on across the grass. "That was fast," Birdie said, slightly breathless from the run, her hair coming loose from its pins and rain running down her face. "Always is out here," Joseph said. He was standing close, because the porch was not large and they had both arrived at the same corner of it, and the rain had soaked his shirt dark and plastered it against his shoulders, and there was a drop of water traveling down the line of that scar on his cheekbone, and Birdie was very aware of all of these things simultaneously. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was no longer carefully composed, because the rain and the thunder and the lightning had apparently taken the careful composure with them when they arrived. "Birdie," he said. "Joseph," she said. The thunder rolled over them again, close and tremendous. "I think," he said very carefully in the voice that meant he was choosing each word for its exact weight, "that I should tell you something." "Yes," she said. "I have been trying for approximately 3 weeks not to be a man who makes things complicated for a woman who is trying to get on a stage to Texas." "I did not get on the stage," she pointed out. "No," he said. "You spent my dollar on cornbread and said you were staying." A pause. "I have not stopped thinking about that." The rain came down. Lightning lit the underside of the clouds in brilliant white. "What have you been thinking about it?" she asked. That it was the most, he stopped, started again. "I have met a lot of people in 4 years of moving around. I have not met anyone who would do that, not out of obligation or because they had to. Just because," he stopped again, and she could see that he was frustrated with his own words, which was unusual for him. "Just because it seemed right," she finished softly. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She reached up and touched the scar on his cheekbone with 2 fingers, lightly, as if she were confirming the reality of it, and he went very still, the way a person goes still when something they have been waiting for has arrived, and they are afraid to breathe in case it goes away. "I think," she said, just as carefully as he had said his words, "that you are the most genuinely good person I have met in a long time, Joseph Shelby, and I would like to know what you are going to do about that." He covered her hand with his, the one still touching his face, and held it there, and looked at her for a long moment in the blue-white light of the storm. Then he leaned down and kissed her with great gentleness and entire certainty, and the thunder rolled away over the Kansas plain like applause. September on the Delaney Ranch was the most beautiful month, Martha told her, and Birdie came to believe it absolutely. The summer's ferocity softened into something golden and generous, the heat becoming warmth, the light becoming the particular amber color of late afternoon that seemed to turn everything it touched into something important. The grass on the plain went from green to tawny gold, and the sky was deeper and more serious, the blue of a place that was beginning to think about winter. The cattle work wound down toward the end of the month, and with it came the question that both of them had been circling around in the way you circle around a thing you want, but aren't yet sure how to ask for. Harlan Delaney called them both into his front room one evening and told them that the fall work was wrapping up and he wouldn't need the extra hands through the winter, but that he had heard from a man he trusted that a town called Medicine Lodge, 60 miles southwest, was growing fast, and a couple of capable, hard-working people could make something of themselves there. "I'm not trying to move you along," Delaney said, with his characteristic bluntness. "Martha would keep you both through winter if she had her way, but I thought you ought to know your options." Martha, from the doorway, said, "Harlan Delaney, you could have led with the part about me wanting them to stay." "She wants you to stay," Delaney said. Birdie and Joseph exchanged a look that was, by this point in their acquaintance, one of many that communicated complete and specific sentences without words. They walked out that evening to the flat rock by the creek, which had become their place in the way that certain places become belonging to certain people, and they sat for a while with the creek talking beside them and the stars coming out above. "Medicine Lodge," Joseph said. "It's a growing town," Birdie said. "Which means it needs things. A blacksmith, maybe," he said. "There's money in that if the town is big enough." "And a boarding house or a hotel needs a cook and a manager," she said, "or a shop of some kind." He looked at her in the starlight. "Are we planning something?" She looked back at him. "I think we might be. Together." The word held all the things that word holds when it is said in that particular way by 2 people who have been moving toward each other since a bench outside a stage depot in a Kansas summer, and have arrived at last at the place where the next thing needs to be named. "I would like that," she said simply, "if you would." He was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to mean something, and then he said, "I have been in a great many places in 4 years, Birdie, and I have not wanted to stay anywhere. And I have been on this ranch for 6 weeks, and I have not thought once about where I am going next." He paused. "That is because of you. All of it is because of you." She felt the words go through her the way warmth goes through a person who has been cold. Not the sharp heat of something sudden, but the deep, thorough warmth of something real. "Then let's go to Medicine Lodge," she said. "Together." He took her hand in the dark and held it with the same steadiness he did everything, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and the creek kept talking beside them, and above them the Kansas stars were so numerous and so close that it seemed impossible that a sky could contain that many necessary things and still have room for more. 3 weeks later, they said goodbye to the Delaney Ranch. Martha Delaney hugged Birdie for a long time and gave her a jar of preserved peaches and a piece of her mind about taking care of herself and writing letters. Harlan Delaney shook Joseph's hand and told him he was a good worker and a better man, and if things went sideways to come back. Rodriguez, who was a man of few words, said only "good luck," but said it in a way that contained all the other things he might have said if he were the kind of man who said them. They traveled to Medicine Lodge by wagon, having arranged a ride with a freighter named Walt who was going in that direction anyway, and seemed pleased enough to have company. The 60 miles took 2 days, and they spent one night camped by a creek somewhere in the middle of it. Walt rolled in his blankets on one side of the fire and Birdie and Joseph on the other, talking in low voices about everything and nothing until the fire burned low, and the talk became sleepy and eventual silence, and Birdie slept better that night under the open Kansas sky than she could remember sleeping in a long time. Medicine Lodge in the fall of 1878 was not large, but it had serious intentions. The town had been a point of considerable historical significance just 10 years earlier, when the Medicine Lodge peace treaties had been negotiated nearby. And while the consequences of those treaties for the Kiowa, Comanche, Plains Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples had been profoundly unjust, the town itself had grown up afterward with the particular energy of places that find themselves at the intersection of things. There was a main street with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel called the Lodge House, a livery stable, a barber shop, a doctor's office, and a number of empty buildings that had their shutters open in the manner of spaces waiting to become something. The blacksmith's shop was one of those spaces. The previous blacksmith, a man named Greer, had died the previous spring, and his shop had been sitting idle because no one in Medicine Lodge had the specific combination of skills and equipment to reopen it. The mayor, a compact, opinionated man named Aldrich, told them this on their second day in town, when he encountered them in the street and asked, with the frank curiosity of a man who ran a town and needed to know who was in it, who they were and what they did. Joseph told him about the blacksmithing. Aldrich's eyes brightened with the particular brightness of a man who has a problem and has just been introduced to its solution. "That shop has been sitting there since March," Aldrich said. "I'll give you the use of it for 6 months, rent deferred against a percentage of what you earn. Fair terms." Joseph looked at Birdie. Birdie looked at Aldrich. "What about the hotel?" she said. "The Lodge House. What's its situation?" Aldrich blinked, recalibrating. "Rosie Fenn runs it. Good woman, but she's been doing it alone since her husband passed in '76, and she's told me twice this year that she needs help." Birdie said, "I'd like to talk to Rosie Fenn." Rosie Fenn turned out to be a stout woman of 55 with white hair and eyes the color of dark coffee, and the kind of practical warmth that comes from decades of feeding, housing, and generally managing large numbers of people in difficult circumstances. She took one look at Birdie, asked her 3 specific questions about cooking, linen management, and how she handled difficult guests, and hired her before the afternoon was out. So they had, within their first week in Medicine Lodge, the beginning of something. The blacksmith shop had Greer's old forge and tools, most of which were salvageable, and Joseph spent the first 2 weeks cleaning and repairing and getting the forge operational, which was the kind of detailed, careful, physical work that suited him completely. Birdie worked at the Lodge House, which was a 6-room hotel above a dining room that served meals to hotel guests and the public both, and she brought to it the same methodical energy she had brought to Mrs. Delacroix's backroom and the Delaney Ranch House kitchen, and Rosie Fenn, who had been cautiously optimistic, became enthusiastically satisfied. In the evenings they met for supper, sometimes at the Lodge House dining room, sometimes at the small house they had rented on the north end of town, a 2-room place with a porch and a garden that had gone to weeds but showed, under the weeds, evidence of having once been tended with care. The garden was Birdie's project through October. She dug it and turned the soil and planted the things that could still be planted before the first frost, and Joseph came home one evening to find her on her knees in the dirt pulling up bindweed, with the focused intensity she brought to most things, her hair loose and a smear of dark soil on her jaw, and he stood in the garden gate for a long moment looking at her before she noticed him. When she looked up, something moved across his face that she had been seeing more often lately, something open and unguarded that she recognized as joy in its most particular and personal form, not the performance of happiness but the actual experience of it. "You're staring," she said. "Yes," he said, making no effort to stop. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the direct, honest gaze that was her particular way. "Joseph Shelby," she said, "we have been in Medicine Lodge for 3 weeks." "We have," he agreed. "And I have been thinking," she said, carefully and precisely, the way she said things when they mattered, "that I would like for this to be permanent. Not just the house and the work," but she paused. "Us." He came across the garden and crouched down in front of her, which brought him eye to eye with her, and he looked at her for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that she had been reading for 2 months now and could read clearly. "I was going to ask you," he said. "I have been trying to find the right moment." "This is the right moment," she said. "I'm wearing garden dirt and there's a weed in my hand, and this is exactly the right moment." He took the weed out of her hand and set it aside with a gravity that she found, despite herself, quite affecting, and then he took her hand, the garden-dirty one, and held it in both of his. "Birdie Shepard," he said, "I would like very much for this to be permanent, all of it. For as long as you'll have me." "That will be a very long time," she said. They were married in early November, at the small church in Medicine Lodge, by a minister named Reverend Cole, who had married a good number of couples in his time, and performed the ceremony with the appropriate combination of gravity and warmth. Martha Delaney drove 60 miles to be there, and cried happy tears into a handkerchief she had brought specifically for the purpose. Rosie Fenn stood up with Birdie. Walt the freighter happened to be in Medicine Lodge that day, and came to the church as a witness with great good humor. Rodriguez, who had ridden over from the Delaney ranch for reasons he described as being in the neighborhood, stood next to Joseph in the front of the church and was quietly moved in the manner of a man who does not express emotion, but is nonetheless experiencing it. The ceremony was simple and true, and when Reverend Cole reached the part where he asked if they would have each other in the particular, permanent, unwavering way that marriage demands, both of them said yes with the directness of people who mean exactly what they say. Afterward, Rosie Fenn made a supper at the lodge house dining room that was not modest, and the small party ate and talked and told stories, and Martha Delaney told the story of the morning they had arrived at the Delaney ranch. A man and a woman walking 9 miles from Caldwell with a bundle of food, and a manner that suggested something was either already happening between them or about to. And she looked at Joseph and Birdie as she told it with the affectionate certainty of a woman who had seen it from the beginning and was pleased to have been right. Joseph Shelby's blacksmith shop opened officially in November, and by December it was busy enough that he was turning work away. The town needed a smith, and he was a good one, and word traveled, as it does in small towns, quickly and completely. By the following spring, he had 2 horses he had taken in lieu of payment when the payment couldn't be made, which was how he had a horse again, 2 in fact, a solid bay gelding named Rounder, and a gray mare that Birdie decided was hers and called Patience. The lodge house dining room expanded its hours in January under Birdie's management, and by spring, it was the place in Medicine Lodge where people came not just for the food but for the quality of the welcome, because Birdie had a gift for making people feel that they had arrived somewhere that had been expecting them. Rosie Fenn, who had been running on empty for 2 years, handed over more and more of the management and found, to her delighted relief, that everything not only continued but improved, and she spent several afternoons a week in a rocking chair on the porch of the lodge house reading novels from the collection she had been unable to enjoy for years, which she regarded as one of the significant rewards of old age. Spring of 1879 arrived with the particular exuberance of Kansas springs, which carry in them all the force of a winter's worth of stored energy. The prairie bloomed in a succession of colors, and the garden behind their house, which Birdie had planted in fall and winter in all the ways that a Kansas garden could be planted, came alive in a way that satisfied her deeply. She told Joseph in April, in the kitchen of their house at the north end of town, on a morning when the light was coming through the window in long, warm bands, and the coffee was good, and the day was not yet busy. She told him simply and directly, because she was a woman who said what she meant, and what she said was that there was going to be a baby in October. He put down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that moved through several things in quick succession, things that were large and a little frightening and entirely good. "October," he said. "Give or take," she said. He stood up and came around the table and held her with the thoroughness of a man who was trying to hold all the things he was feeling at once, and she let herself be held with the completeness of a woman who was not accustomed to letting herself be held, and was discovering that it was one of the better experiences available to a person. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am extremely all right," he laughed, that sudden unguarded laugh she had first heard on the walk to the Delaney ranch, and she felt it all the way through. The summer of 1879 was the summer that Medicine Lodge grew up. 2 new businesses opened on the main street. A second church was established. The schoolhouse was expanded to accommodate the increasing number of children whose families had come to the area and decided to stay. Joseph Shelby's shop took on a part-time helper, a 16-year-old boy named Henry who was not afraid of hard work and who reminded Joseph, in ways he didn't entirely articulate, of his younger self. Birdie kept working at the lodge house through June and into July, when Rosie Fenn, with fond but firm authority, told her to take the last months before the baby easy, and trust that the dining room was capable of managing without her, which it was, because Birdie had spent the previous year building a system that didn't depend on any single person to function, including herself. She spent those last months finishing the garden, writing letters, reading the books on Rosie Fenn's shelf and ordering 2 more from a catalog, and in the evenings she sat on the porch with Joseph, who had taken to coming home earlier now that Henry was capable of closing up the shop, and they talked about everything and nothing in the way they had been talking since a bench outside a stage depot in Caldwell, Kansas, 14 months ago. One evening in September, when the light was doing its amber thing and the garden was in its late summer fullness, Joseph said, out of a comfortable silence, "Do you ever think about that morning, in Caldwell, the morning I didn't get on the stage? I offered you $1, he said. I thought it was mine to offer. It was the last dollar I had. I know, she said. I spent it on food and told you I was staying. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know what to make of that. I know, she said again, smiling. You kept saying I had a plan. You did have a plan. I had a better one, she said. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes in the September light. Yes, he said, you absolutely did. She reached over and took his hand, and they sat in the evening together. And the prairie stretched away from them in every direction, enormous and specific, a landscape that demanded something from the people in it and gave enormously back to those who gave it something in return. Their son was born on the 3rd of October, 1879, in the small room off the kitchen of their house at the north end of Medicine Lodge, Kansas, with the assistance of a doctor named Finch who was capable and kind, and who told Joseph, waiting in the kitchen with Martha Delaney who had come for the birth, that everything was well before Joseph had finished the sentence he was trying to formulate when the doctor appeared. They named him William, for no particularly dramatic reason, only that it was a name both of them liked, a name that felt solid and honest and full of possibility. Birdie looked at William in the first quiet hour after he arrived, that small, definite, impossible person who was both entirely new and entirely familiar, and thought about her mother, who had known the names of all the plants and had believed that naming a thing was the first step toward not being afraid of it. William Henry Shelby, she thought. Here is your name. Now neither of us needs to be afraid." Joseph sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at William with the overwhelmed, wonder-struck face of a man encountering something completely outside the range of his previous experience, and finding it vast and good. He didn't say anything for a long time, just looked, the way he had always looked at things that mattered, with complete and steady attention. "He has your eyes," Birdie said. "He has your jaw," Joseph said. "Stubborn," she said. "Determined," he said, and she laughed. And William, at the sound of his mother's laughter, made a small sound that was not quite a response but was something. And Joseph looked at her over their son's head with everything he had never quite found the right words for, and that had never needed words anyway. The winter of 1879 was cold and quiet in the way that Kansas winters are cold and quiet. A deep stillness over the snow-covered plain that made the world feel very close and very complete. The blacksmith's shop banked its fire and kept shorter hours. The lodge house dining room was busy with the particular warmth that a good warm room with good food has in cold weather, which is a warmth that is partly temperature and partly something that doesn't have a word in English, but that everyone who has experienced it knows immediately. Birdie had gone back to the lodge house 3 days a week by December, because Rosie Finn's health had not been entirely robust through the fall, and because Birdie found that she was not, by nature, a person who was comfortable being idle, and because the lodge house was by now so much her own creation that being away from it felt like being away from a part of herself. She brought William with her in the mornings, in the wooden basket that Joseph had made for exactly this purpose, and William was an excellent lodge house employee in the sense that he was pleasant to the guests and asked for nothing beyond milk and warmth. Joseph's younger brother Thomas came in February, driving a wagon from Missouri with his wife, a schoolteacher named Clara who was small and precise and bright-eyed, and who, within 24 hours of arriving in Medicine Lodge, had decided that the town needed a better school and had begun forming opinions about how to provide one. Thomas Shelby was a taller, broader, somewhat less contained version of his brother, and the two of them together in a room produced a warmth that Birdie found she liked enormously, the particular warmth of brothers who genuinely like each other and have missed each other more than they have said. Thomas and Clara stayed. Thomas found work at the lumber yard and then bought a partial stake in it. Clara, who had been a schoolteacher in Missouri, approached the Medicine Lodge School Committee in March and was hired with a promptness that reflected both her qualifications and the committee's desperation. They built a house on the east side of town, and by summer the two Shelby families were in the habit of Sunday dinners that rotated between the two houses and that grew, over the subsequent months and years, to include an expanding circle of people who were connected to each of them in various ways. Rodriguez retired from the Delaney Ranch in 1880 and came to Medicine Lodge, where he had a cousin, and ended up, through a chain of circumstances that began with a conversation in the lodge house dining room, teaching young men in the area to work horses in the quiet, careful way he knew, which was more art than craft and which produced results that Harlan Delaney, when he heard of it, regarded with the respect of a man who knows quality. The years moved in the way of years that are full, not slowly but with a weight and a substance that makes their passing feel significant rather than merely inevitable. William grew from the small, certain person of his first days into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's quietness and both their stubbornness, and who was, by common consent of everyone who knew the family, both a handful and a delight. In 1882, a daughter arrived and they named her Mary, for Birdie's mother. Mary was small and bright and loud in her opinions from the very first day, and Joseph looked at her with the same overwhelmed wonder he had looked at William and said, very quietly, that he thought she was going to run something by the time she was 30, which everyone who met her subsequently believed. The lodge house passed formally into Birdie's management in 1883, when Rosie Fenn, whose health had declined gradually and honestly, decided that she had earned her rest and that the lodge house was in hands she trusted entirely. She signed it over to Birdie for a sum that Birdie and Joseph had worked and saved toward for 2 years, and on the morning the paperwork was finalized, Rosie Fenn sat in her rocking chair on the porch and looked at the main street of Medicine Lodge with the peaceful expression of a woman whose work is finished and who is satisfied with what she has done with it. "You take care of her," Rosie said, meaning the lodge house. "I will," Birdie said. "I know," Rosie said, and went back to her novel. Joseph's blacksmith shop had by then expanded into a proper business with 2 full-time employees besides himself, serving not just Medicine Lodge but the surrounding ranches and farms. And Joseph was known in the area with the kind of quiet, solid reputation that belongs to men who do what they say they will do, and do it well without requiring anyone to notice. He had also, in the spring of 1883, gone looking for 3 cowboys who had been making trouble for the smaller homesteaders north of town, approaching the matter with the same practical calm with which he approached everything, and the details of what had been said and what had been implied during that conversation were not fully known to anyone outside it. But the trouble stopped, and the homesteaders, several of whom were families who had come to Kansas looking for the same thing that everyone who came to Kansas was looking for, knew who to thank. Birdie, when she heard about it, looked at the scar on his cheekbone and said, "You got too close to a fight that wasn't yours again." "It was mine," he said simply. "If you live here, it's yours." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." Medicine Lodge kept growing the way a good town grows, not explosively but steadily, with the incremental, durable growth of a place that has things worth coming for. The school that Clara Shelby had taken in hand became a proper schoolhouse with 2 rooms. The doctor's office became a proper practice. The lodge house, under Birdie's management, became the kind of establishment that people talked about when they talked about the good things in a place, the thing that told you what a town was really like. On a Sunday evening in October of 1884, 5 years to the month since William had been born, the family sat on the porch of the house at the north end of town. The house had been expanded twice since they had first rented it, now with a proper parlor and 3 bedrooms, and a kitchen that was large enough for the cooking that Birdie did, and that drew people to the door with a regularity that suggested the neighbors had noticed. The garden was in its fall state, stripped and turned and planted with the things that could winter over, but the structure of it was clear, the order that had been built into it over years. William, who was 5 and believed himself to be approximately 40, was sitting on the porch step, examining a rock he had found that afternoon with the intense scrutiny of a young naturalist. Mary, who was 2, was asleep against Birdie's shoulder with the boneless completeness of small children asleep, one fist curled against Birdie's collarbone. Joseph was in the chair beside Birdie, close enough that their arms were touching, and he was looking at the prairie in the last of the evening light, the way the grass moved in the west wind, and the way the sky above it was doing the deep rose and amber thing it did in October evenings, the color of something preserved and perfect. He turned and looked at Birdie. She was looking at the prairie too, and the light was in her face, and she had Mary's weight against her shoulder, and her expression was the expression of a woman who is, in all the dimensions that matter, exactly where she means to be. She felt him looking and turned. "What?" she said, softly, not to wake Mary. "I was thinking about Caldwell," he said. "You have been thinking about Caldwell a great deal lately," she said, with the gentle amusement that had developed between them over 6 years of daily conversation. "A particular morning in Caldwell," he said. "I think about it sometimes. What would have happened if you had gotten on the stage?" "You would have walked to the Delaney Ranch alone," she said, "and gotten the job, and saved up enough to open the shop somewhere and been all right." "Yes," he said, "probably." "But," she said, because there was a but, she could hear it. He was quiet for a moment. William had set down the rock and was looking at the sky with the same sustained attention that was his clearest inheritance from his father. The wind moved through the garden, finding the last dry stalks. "I have been all right many times," Joseph said. "In a lot of different places. All right is not," he paused. "All right was what I had before. This is something else entirely." She looked at him with all the directness that had always been her nature. "Yes," she said softly, "it is." Mary shifted in her sleep and made a small sound, and Birdie adjusted her hold with the practiced ease of a woman who has carried a child for 2 years and knows every configuration of that particular small body. William picked up his rock again and turned it over to examine the other side. Joseph reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from Birdie's face, the simple, unremarkable gesture of a man who has been doing this for years, and for whom it has not become less deliberate. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and the prairie stretched away to the west in the last light, enormous and particular and entirely unconcerned with the small human lives at its edge, which were, in their smallness, as complete as anything the wide world offered. 6 years earlier, a woman had walked into a town with a carpetbag and a broken heart she hadn't yet named. A man had been sitting on a bench outside a stage depot, looking like something the wind had left. $1 had changed hands, or rather had not changed hands in the expected direction, had instead been spent on cornbread and salt pork, and the specific, unambiguous declaration that someone was staying. The woman was Birdie Shepard, who became Birdie Shelby, who built a hotel dining room that people talked about when they talked about the good things in Medicine Lodge, who kept a garden with intention and cooked with love, and said what she meant and meant what she said, and had never, not once, regretted the morning she spent the last $1 on food and chose staying over going. The man was Joseph Shelby, who fixed things with his hands and steadied ladders in storms and got too close to fights that were not his when someone needed help, who learned the names of hawks and wrote to his brother twice a year, and held his wife with thoroughness, and looked at his children with wonder, and had built, from flat broke and a beat-up hat and a heart that had always been as good as it was quiet, a life that was full in every direction. William grew up to be a veterinarian, which surprised no one who had watched him examining rocks and hawks and the various creatures of the Kansas prairie with that serious, attentive gaze from the time he could walk. Mary ran the lodge house, which did not surprise anyone at all, and ran it with her mother's competence and her own particular flair that made it something even beyond what Birdie had made it, which was exactly as it should be when the next generation takes hold of something good. Thomas and Clara Shelby's family and Joseph and Birdie's family grew up together in the easy, tangled way of families who live in the same town and share Sunday dinners and have children who play together from infancy, and the story of how Joseph and Birdie had met, the bench outside the stage depot, the $1, the stage ticket, the cornbread and salt pork, was told so many times at those Sunday dinners that William and Mary and Thomas's children could recite it in their sleep, and did sometimes, when their parents weren't listening, with affectionate theatrical embellishment. Rodriguez lived out his years in Medicine Lodge and was buried there, in the small cemetery on the hill east of town, under a stone that said he had known horses and he had been honest. Rosie Fenn sat on her porch until 1887, and then went quietly in her sleep as she would have wanted, and Birdie mourned her the way you mourn someone who gave you something irreplaceable, which was honestly and for a long time. On a morning in the spring of 1888, 10 years after a woman had walked into Caldwell, Kansas, looking for a stage ticket, Birdie Shelby stood in the garden of the house at the north end of Medicine Lodge and turned the soil with a spade while the morning came in from the east. She was 34 years old and strong and capable, and she knew the name of every plant she grew and several dozen she didn't. She heard the gate open and looked up. Joseph was coming across the garden with 2 cups of coffee. He was 40 now, perhaps, and the sun had deepened the lines around his eyes, and the gray-green of those eyes was the same as it had always been, exactly the color of sage after rain, and he moved with the same unhurried, capable ease he had always moved with, the ease of a man who has made his peace with himself and his place. He handed her the coffee and looked at the turned earth with the attentive, appreciative gaze of a man who understood the work involved. "Early start," he said. "The beans need to go in," she said. He nodded. He looked at the sky, which was doing the thing it did in Kansas in spring, moving through colors with the extravagance of a place that has 12 months of sky to catch up on in one morning. "Beautiful morning," he said. She looked at him over her coffee cup. He was looking at the sky, and the light was in his face. And this was Joseph Shelby, who had sat on a bench outside a stage depot with his hat over his eyes and his last dollar in his pocket, and had offered it to a woman he had known for 3 hours because it had seemed like a practical thing to do. "Yes," Birdie said, and meant the morning and the garden and the coffee and the town and the 10 years and the 2 children asleep inside the house and the man beside her and everything, all of it, every piece of the thing they had built from that one unremarkable, extraordinary morning. "Yes," she said again, softly. "It really is." The wind moved through the early garden, and the sky kept changing over the Kansas plain, and Joseph Shelby put his arm around Birdie Shelby's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the light of a spring morning that was theirs, entirely and permanently theirs, as all the mornings after it would be, as everything worth having always is, not found at the end of a long road but recognized, suddenly and completely, in the moment when you put down what you were carrying and say, "I am staying. I am home."